Welcome to Dark Dreams.
Horrified Press. horrifiedpress.wordpress.com.
The Arch Vile by David Dunwoody. We all wear masks. Mrs. Robbins poured Benford a cup of tea. He unfolded his hands to take it from her. His hands were stiff and numb from the cold outside, and the warmth of the china felt like tiny pinpricks in his palms. As he blew steam away from the tea and watched the sickly green surface ripple, he heard her words. "I know they killed my son." Benford continued staring into the cup. After a moment he braved a sip, scalded the tip of his tongue. He set the cup down and was forced to look up at her. "You sound certain. Why?" Of course, he knew she was right, but his mask was firmly in place. "They wouldn't give us his body," Miss Robbins said. Her face was thin and tired. She had been grieving her boy for almost a year now. The fact that she had summoned him only now meant that she had thought this matter through, rationally, and she had done her homework. "I know that we were given a plot at the estate, and I know we agreed to that, but—" She shook her head. "We didn't really think they would hold us to that, of all things. We have a family plot in Manchester. We want Noah there, where we'll be. My husband went so far as to try and buy him back from them." Her fingers unfolded her teacup in an effort to keep from shaking. "We've been one of the Sylvan House's greatest benefactors, and now they won't even return our calls. Those two women—" She looked up at Benford apologetically, but he waved the comment away. "If you have anything you would like passed on to my aunts, I'll hand-deliver it to them this very afternoon. As for Noah, I can assure you, you'll have him by the end of the week." Mrs. Robbins' eyes filled with tears. "You mean it?" "I promise." "Mr. Benford, do you believe me?" "About Noah's death?" "Yes, of course, yes." "I don't know." He rose from the table and she rose with him. "I would have thought you'd deny it outright. Do you know something? Please tell me." "Teresa." He took her hand, putting on the most compassionate face he could. "It'll all come out in the end. For now, please just trust me. And please, don't say anything to anyone else. Not yet. Tell Paul the same." "We've known you a long time," she said. "I've known you a long time." "Then trust me," he told her. Back in the town car, Benford Sylvan Benford sorted through the sheaves of paperwork he had with him. He knew he could rely on Teresa to keep silent. Her mask was a thin fabrication, that of a born-again Christian who wore a plastic smile and a plastic personality for a god she had yet to meet. He knew the real woman had bedded her years ago, shortly after her marriage to Paul Robbins. She wore her mask for her husband, not him. He unscrewed the top off some cheap wine he'd grabbed on the way into the city and fetched a glass. He felt like taking a pull straight from the bottle, but now wasn't the time to show weakness. Never mind the fact that he needed the wine to get through the day's grim task. His aunts already knew he was a drunk, but he could keep from splashing the swill on his suit. He'd been the attorney for them and for the Sylvan House since the mid-90s. He avoided going out to the estate as much as possible, preferring instead to work with all the board members at the March Clinic. He loathed being alone with the wretched spinsters for any length of time, least of all in that dreadful old house. When at the clinic, the Sylvan sisters at least bore some semblance of humanity. Still, every now and then, one of them would catch his eye, and he'd see something dark and familiar in that white bag of flesh, and lose his words. They liked doing that to him. It troubled him a little that he wore his masks with the same ease. It was a necessary part of his work, and there was no malevolence behind it. But sometimes he wondered. They were bound by blood, after all, and even had the same hawk-like features, though theirs were sunken in slack, fatty tissue, though their eyes were yellow and clouded by cataracts. But that was merely another ruse, their frail little bodies hiding terrible things. He knew, had always known. When he was a boy, he had spent summers working at the Sylvan house, changing bedsheets and washing dishes. His mother had insisted upon it, even though his father hated her older sisters. Though he had felt obligated to bestow the Sylvan name upon his only son, he had bookended it with the two Benfords for that very reason. "You're not like them," his dad would say. "Neither is your mum. Not entirely, anyway." The Sylvan house was home to anywhere from 10 to 20 children at a time, all afflicted with Reiniger-Fox syndrome, and they were all in the last stage of the strange illness. The March Clinic sent children out to the estate when there was nothing more they could do. It was simply too difficult for the parents to care for their own at that point. Between the skin deformity and violent seizures and unpredictable aggression, most parents of children with Reiniger-Fox eventually agreed it was best to start saying goodbye in the last stage. The town car turned onto the narrow country lane that led to the estate. A light snow had begun to fall. Benford drained his glass. As a child, he was forbidden to go anywhere near the small cemetery down the path from the back of the house. He kept mostly to the kitchen and the laundry beneath it. The other children, the ones who lived there, were kept upstairs. Sometimes he would hear muffled footfalls and alien groans from overhead. It chilled him to the bone, and Aunts Ruth and Georgia knew it. "They're just little ones like you," Ruth would say, pinching his cheek between two fat forefingers and twisting the flesh. "I'm sure they would like to play with you. Maybe one day we'll let them play with you, Ben." He felt safest down in the laundry, away from both the children and his aunts, and would spend as much time as possible down there. He washed and bleached sheets speckled with blood and pus, folding and refolding them until his prolonged absence was noticed, and he was shrilly summoned. The room was garishly lit and cold, the walls bare concrete, but it was more comfortable, more real, than the facade upstairs. Sylvan House was a horror. He had never been forced to spend the night there, and could scarcely imagine what it was like then, in the dark. Once, working in the laundry, he'd heard a soft titter from behind the dryer. Benford had frozen in place, eyes darting over the machine, and he'd seen the little shadow against the wall and known one of them was out. She giggled. That only made it worse. He was 11 and girls had taken on an allure that made them somehow threatening. He had started to wonder what they looked like naked and what they thought of him. Their laughter was a riddle to him. He had no idea what to expect from the girl hiding in the corner, so he waited. Her face slowly emerged from behind the dryer. He recognized her. She'd been in his class the year before, at St. Andrews. She had bouncing black locks of hair and glittering blue eyes. She was pretty. He swallowed hard and tried to muster a greeting, but all that came from his throat was a whisper. She smiled. He smiled back. She came out from behind the dryer. Half her face was gone. Beneath the left eye, her cheek was all but rotted away, the bone of her jaw exposed. The eye was bloodshot, and darted about of its own volition while the other stared at him, and she smiled. All she could do was smile. He'd run upstairs, screaming. His aunts had been in the kitchen. For the first and only time in his life, he ran to them. "Oh, she must be down there," Georgina said. She looked down at him with disdain. "Did you wet yourself, Benford?" "What? No." He glanced fearfully at the cellar door. She was... "Just a little girl, Benford," Georgina cooed. "She only wanted to play." He decided that day that he hated his aunts. No, not hated, loathed. They were cruel and miserable, and he was terrified of them. And so, that evening after supper, before his mother came to pick him up, he went down the path to the cemetery. He saw Ruth moving among the headstones, 40 or so altogether at the time. She was chasing after someone. No, something. A little dog which limped through the undergrowth toward the gate where Benford stood, watching. Ruth spied him as he approached. Her face, which was already dark with frustration, reddened. Benford had never seen the little brown dog before. He knelt and reached through the gate. It was scared of her, too. It ran to him and turned its face up toward his, and he saw the red, diseased eyes and pus-encrusted lips, and he jerked his hand back just as the dog snapped at it with rotting teeth. Ruth caught hold of its tail. It yelped, then snarled. Through gasps of breath, Ruth said, "Someone's been feeding it scraps," and then she stomped its head into the dirt. As Benford left with his mother, he heard Ruth yelling from upstairs, followed by the plaintive cries of children. When he came back the following week, he glimpsed workmen in the back with a new headstone. They took it in a wheelbarrow down the path to the cemetery. He said nothing of what he'd seen, not to anyone, but on that day he resolved to find out what was really going on in the house. He resolved to expose his aunts, to his mother, and to the world. He was a man now, and though his mother had recently passed on, he felt it was probably better this way. The truth of what went on in Sylvan House would have broken her heart, for the young Benford had been diligent in his investigation, had seen the black bottle from which his aunts added to every meal they prepared for the children. Years later he had finally tracked down the same black bottle with the same strange label, and he now knew that they'd been poisoning their charges. Benford exited the town car and steadied himself. He drank more than he meant to. He felt like that little boy again as he looked up at the house. Then he slipped on his mask and went up the porch steps. "It's a right shock to see you here," Ruth cooed as she lumbered away from the open door. "I didn't think our nephew liked visiting us any more." "I'm here on business," Benford said. He glanced down the driveway to the road before shutting the door. They'd be here soon. There was just enough time for him to tell his aunts what he'd done. He turned back to find both of them there. Georgina's sagging face pulled into a toothy grin. "What brings you out here in such frightful weather?" "Oh, it's not so bad," Benford replied. "The earth isn't frozen just yet." She frowned. "What do you mean, Benford?" He motioned through the door to the drawing room. "Please." His aunts sat side by side on a sofa. They glowered at him. His assertiveness was clearly troubling them, and he tried not to relish it too much. Not yet. As he sat the documents out on the table before him. "The papers you signed last week." "For the grant?" Ruth said uncertainly. "No. There is no grant." Benford stood and clasped his hands. "You cleared my people to excavate the cemetery. We're exhuming all of them. All 80. Georgina's face went white. She seized her sister's hand. "You can't!" "I am." He heard the trucks just then, and smiled. You lied to us. We'll sue." "If you like. But I think you'll be occupied with the murder charges against you." He stared into each of their eyes. He'd never seen them like this. They were the ones terrified. His blood raced as he took it in. "You can't," Georgina repeated. "Today's the day." He walked through the foyer and started toward the back. They shambled after him. "We believed you. We're family, Benford. Why?" He whirled. "Because you're inhuman." Years of anger took hold of him. He stabbed his finger in their faces. "You fed them poison. You took their parents' fortunes. You and the clinic gave them hope. But they all ended up here in this horrible house, and then in that graveyard." "There was nothing else we could do," Ruth began. "I'll deal with Mr. Talent and the rest of the board later. First the bodies, the proof." He went out through the snow and met Ronnie Del Vecchio there. The burly American clapped his hands together. "You sure you want to go ahead with this? We can wait until the weather's clear." "Do it now," Benford said. "We need to hurry. Trust me." Del Vecchio looked past him to the two old women. They were kneading their hands and muttering to one another. "You sure this is all on the up and up?" he asked. "Did the payment clear?" Benford snapped. Del Vecchio guffawed. "Sometimes I think you touched in the head, boy." "I'll touch you in the head if you don't start turning the earth." Benford waved at the workmen coming around the side of the house. "Let's go!" All right. Del led his crew down the path. "This is a mistake," Ruth cried. "Benford!" "I'm going to tear this house down once you're gone," he said without looking back. The spinsters wailed. He walked down the path and stood by as the cemetery gate was torn from the earth to admit a pair of backhoes. "We had to do it," Georgina cried. "There was no other way." She grabbed Benford by the shoulder. Her grip surprised him, and he was unable to tear her hand away. "They were already doomed," she said. "The rest was drowned out by the machinery." Steel plates were pulled from the earth over the most recent graves. The backhoes dug their great claws into the soil below. Ruth screamed in Benford's face. "We had to make sure they were kept here. Contained! The syndrome is—" She turned abruptly, running into the cemetery. "Stop! Stop!" It didn't matter what their intent was, Benford told himself, or who had called upon them to do it. They were evil women. It permeated everything they did. Del let out a long, loud shriek. He dropped from the backhoe he was operating and scrambled away from the grave it had opened. As Benford watched, a pair of tiny gray hands reached up to catch falling flakes. Benford's jaw went slack. Beside him, Georgina shook her head. Another child clambered up the arm of the second backhoe and lunged at its operator. Screams filled the air. The workmen shoved Benford aside as they fled, all except for Del and the other operator. They'd been caught by the children. A boy in a mahogany-colored suit, his head little more than a long-haired skull, tore into the back of Del neck. The man fell motionless in the dirt. More hands emerged from the holes. It was as if the other interred were tunneling into the open graves en masse, climbing the backhoes like insects. Ruth was running from them. They swarmed over the dead workmen and onto her back. What had he done? He was right about them. How could he have been wrong about this? How had he not seen? We all wear masks. Sometimes we manage to cover our own eyes. "Always wanting to play," Georgina said softly, eyes wide, and she made no effort to flee as they came for her. Benford ran up the path and into the house. He slammed the door shut and pulled a table in front of it just as their bodies hit the other side. He ran through the kitchen and down to the laundry. He crawled behind the dryer, squeezing himself into the narrow space as best he could, and held his breath, and listened for their laughter. Waited for his mask to be torn away forever. When it was done, when all the bones had been picked clean, the children left the estate together. They trudged through the snow along the roadside. Some would run ahead, slipping and sliding as flecks of blood flew from their mouths, wild with hunger, but they always returned to the group. Skeletal hands were joined as broken stragglers fought to keep going. Their hollow-eyed companions pulled them back to their feet. They were a strange sight. The ruined lot, shambling quietly along in their burial clothes. Approaching vehicles slowed at the sight of the children in their threadbare suits and dresses, then tore away when the faces became visible. The children paid no mind to this, with the light of the sky in their eyes, and their bellies warm and full. They had found they could focus. It wasn't like it had been before. There was no feeling, neither pain nor emotion, and the only scraps of fractured memory were those they'd kept in the deepest wells of their hearts. But the children knew now what they really wanted. They wanted their parents.
The moon is full and it is dripping with blood.
Now comes Blood Moon Rising magazine.
Original fiction,
Creature features,
nightmarish artwork.
interviews, and other original horror.
Visit bloodmoonrisingmagazine.com and join our Rising Legion.
I say every house in America should have an electric chair. And every man just once in his life should sit in it. just so that he can feel the power of millions of gallons of electricity flow through his veins. I got an electric chair, that's all I need. You get an electric chair, Sheldon, you don't have to worry about the audience. You get an electric chair, you can tell them anything you want, as long as it's real. You get yourself an electric chair and they'll sit there all night long. Kind of a funny idea, sitting in an electric chair and doing a show. Well, think of the therapeutic value of an electric chair and all the money it is. Yes, an electric chair in every home.
The Electric Chair, a show about horror. ElectricChairShow.com.
An electric chair. Wow.
Yeah.